Welcome to Broadcasting Common Ground, the Deep Foundation Institute's podcast channel. In this series, Interview with a Survivor, our hosts, Lucky and Tim, will be discussing near misses, problem projects, and resolutions. In today's episode, There Will Be Rocks Ahead, Cord Wissmann discusses his professional highs along with a significant low, a failure of a ground improvement system below an MSE wall in the US Midwest. Proudly brought to you by our series sponsor, Peer Research, and today's episode sponsor, Geostructures.
I'm Tim, and I'm glad to be here with my co-host, Lucky. Hi, Lucky.
Hi, Tim. Great to be here.
This is our second episode in our series, Interview with a Survivor, where our guests share their ups and downs on their projects that went wrong. Today, our guest is Cord Wissmann. While many listeners probably know Cord, for those who might not, Cord is the president and chief engineer of Geopier.
In prepping for this show, during our conversations, I learned that Cord wanted to be a civil engineer from a young age and attended Virginia Tech after he was waitlisted by MIT. Cord then attended UC Berkeley and then finally returned to Virginia Tech and completed a PhD. He joined NatFox at Geopier in 1998 and has since been credited with transforming the company into a global ground improvement leader. Cord also holds 28 patents. That's an amazing achievement. One of his many honors is the Wallace Baker Award in recognition of ingenious innovation in the field of ground modification. He's also an avid traveler. I always enjoy listening to his adventures. I understand that biking is your passion, Cord. Can you share one of your biking adventure with our listeners?
Great. Hi, Lucky. Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me on this podcast. Real fun. Yeah, I like to bike a lot. I bike maybe 150 miles a week or so, something like that. And that's not a lot for some people, but a lot for others. And I think maybe one of the funnest adventures I had was I was in Maui one year and got it into my head to ride my bike to the top of the volcano. And that was a nice run. You start at the bottom on the north side of Maui, and then you wind your way up to the top. It's about 10,000 feet at the top. Altitude's low. It's cold up there, and then coming down. Of course, it's exciting coming down. A little easier coming down than going up, but that was a fun one. Yeah.
Adrenaline rush. I love that.
Cord, you and I go back a ways, and we've had many opportunities to kind of sit and talk to one another about a variety of things. And one of the things that we talked about recently is the differences in our childhoods. And, I shared with you that I grew up in a small town in Georgia during the recession. And while our family really never went hungry, there were some desperate times, and we were focused on the present, and we really didn't, we didn't talk about the future that much. It was just mainly what was going on at the time and addressing the needs around us. I've always had a job kind of in turn, and since I was 16, and that was mainly because nobody would hire me before that. I feel like for me, that was formative. That push that I had growing up, it instilled a drive in me. But for you, when we talked, you talked about a much different childhood, and I thought it would be nice to kind of go back and maybe give the listeners some idea of what it was like to grow up Cord Wissmann.
Yeah, I think our childhoods were quite different, Tim, and yet in some respects the same. My parents were German immigrants, and they came over from Germany back in about a year before I was born. I was born in 1964, so they came over in 1963, and they took a lot of their old country with them. So I was raised as a little German kid. Didn't even know I was an American, really. until I was maybe in second or third grade. I sort of identified as being a German kid. We were always supposed to go back to Germany. And then at some point we didn't. And then at some point I realized, no, I was American and very much am an American, served in the Air Force and those kinds of things. But it was interesting, and we were never poor. My parents were middle class. My dad was an engineer, and I think it instilled some of that engineering in me as well. But like you, I started working early too. They had a work ethic. My parents did, and they instilled that upon us. And I think I was 14. I was picking apples, at the orchard, and you could do that when I was 15.
You had mentioned that you thought you would be a civil engineer from an early age, probably way earlier than I even knew civil engineers exist. So how old?
I think third grade or so. However old you are in third grade. Yeah. And my dad, I like building things, and I talked to my dad about what I should be. And he said, well, you should be maybe an architect. And he scratched his head. He said, well, or maybe a civil engineer, because they actually, do the things that enable the architects to do the architecture. And so that's when I learned what a civil engineer might be. And that was one of my goals from third grade on.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I think for someone to think of being a civil engineer at that young age, it's amazing. We have learned that, there are most prominent individuals in our industry who have definitely taught you something and influenced you in who you are today. If you have to pick 3 of them, this is because of the interest of time. I'm sure you can come up with like more than 3. Can you tell something about each of them?
Well, that's a hard row to hoe. There's so many influential engineers and people in my life, for sure, that taught me so much. If I had to pick, I might start with Mike Duncan. He was an undergraduate professor when I was at Virginia Tech. I was taking these geotechnical courses as an undergraduate, and I wanted to go to grad school, and I was asking him about that. And I remember him looking at me, and he said, Cord, beg, borrow, or steal. Do whatever it takes to go to grad school. Right? Beg, borrow, or steal. And Tim, maybe you could have used some of that borrowing. I'm not sure. Maybe for me it was stealing. That was influential to me. Another person I might pick would be Wayne Clough. Wayne was also part of my undergraduate education, but also was my PhD advisor, or at least started it off. And he left Virginia Tech at some point during my PhD. The smart kids, he would take the smart kids with him. When a professor would go to another university, they would take the smart kids with him. And he left me behind at Virginia Tech.
I don't think that had anything to do with it, Corda, but.
So he didn't ask me if I wanted to go with him. But he went off to University of Washington and eventually the Smithsonian. I remember asking him at one point, I said, well, don't you feel bad leaving engineering behind? And his comment to me was, I think I have a lot of things to offer the world, and it's not just engineering that I can offer the world. And that really struck me at that point in my life. You can really do a lot of good in the world, not just engineering, not just your career field. That was good. And then Harry Seed might be a third, and he was teaching at Berkeley when I was there. And it wasn't, again, like the other two, it wasn't really the geomechanics lesson, but he taught a lesson about talking about the problem things that you have in your life, the problems in your technical life. And I remember his quote, went something like this. He said, we like to talk about our successes so much, don't we? And they make us look really good, but we don't learn too much from our successes, do we? And then he went on and talked about why we don't do that. But it was a big impression on me, and I think on a lot of other people, that it's when you have a problem and when things don't go right, you can learn a lot from when things don't go right, both professionally and personally. So I think we're going to talk about that here on this podcast. So it looks good.
Yeah,
I think those are the 3.
Yes, that's such wise advice, Cord. Beg, borrow, or steal, right? I remember, I'm not saying that like literally begging, but it's almost like, looking at other influencers in the industry and borrowing what they have done, what they do best, right? That is amazing. And I love what you said about don't leave any engineer behind. That's such a great thing, right? Like we need to bring everyone together with us, teach them how we taught from others, right? That's amazing. So let's skip ahead to your beginnings at Geopier. In 1998, the concept of performance-based design build for ground improvements was almost non-existent. Geopier has been a part of changing our industry, and now there are many design build ground improvement contractors, right? Look around us. How did this big change happen? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So, in 1998, Nat Fox had already started this Geopier thing, and some people know Nat. He was kind of a wild character. The way I would describe him would be, if you remember good old Doc Brown from Back to the Future, the guy with the crazy hair and the car that would go to the future. That was Nat's twin brother. And that was kind of crazy and a little bit out there, but also brilliant. And he came up with this really simple little thing he called it Geopier, and he started it. And we had nothing when I joined him. We had really no projects, or not many. We had no brand, we had no reputation. We really had a good idea. It was Nat Fox's good idea. And he had good people. He surrounded himself with some really good people. Mike Cowell was definitely one of them. One of the reasons I joined Geopier was because Mike Cowell was part of the Geopier group. I know Mike's going to be on this podcast later, I think. So our challenge at that time was just to convince people that we knew what we were doing, or at least we wouldn't harm their project too much, and we were successful. We made it simple, and we brought it to a lot of folks, and then started growing it. And that's transformed the industry. I would say Nat Fox has transformed the industry in a great way. Today, the challenge is different. It's capitalist society we live in. People want, part of a good deal, of course, and competition is part of it. And so we've attracted a lot of competition over the years. And so, today's challenge is different. It's is to continue to differentiate ourselves from our competition, to continue to upscale the industry and offer new innovative solutions that perhaps other people can't quite do. To be a standard bearer in the industry and to help other people achieve levels of service and levels of quality that we need in the industry to have a strong industry. But I'm actually proud of the competition that I wouldn't say created, but we've attracted competition. I'm proud of that. And by and large, I'm proud of the competitors and the people that run them as well.
Gord, I lived through that. I remember a small anecdote that occurred in the early 90s, mid 90s. And one of my colleagues was in a meeting with Nat Fox, and Nat was doing a very good discussion about what Geopiers could do and that kind of thing. And finally, my colleague looked at him as the geotechnical engineer and said, "How much settlement do you think it would have?" And he looked across the table and said, 1 inch. Then about maybe 3 seconds went by and he goes, no. 3/4 of an inch. They ran a load test. It was 3/4 of an inch dead on. My colleague was a believer. From then on, he's like, Nat Fox knew to the to the 10th of an inch, how much it would settle during a load test. And I do remember how novel it was. We wrote reports that in many cases we were really struggling to deal with risk. And Geopier came in and really led a path forward that everyone could deal with the risk. The owner could understand his risk position. The geotech engineer felt like he could tolerate the risk. And then, of course, Geopier who were hands-on had a way of handling the risk. So anyway, I just wanted to bring up that little anecdotal story about the mad professor and how he won my colleague over.
No, that is very true, Tim. I think I have not lived through it, but I've heard so many stories about Matt Fox. And my first introduction to Geopiers was down in Florida, my first job after graduating. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing, how it was being installed, down in Florida where you have sinkholes and crazy things can happen overnight. It was a lifesaver and a game changer for sure. Definitely. So Cord, as you know, we chose the title Interview with a Survivor for the series, right? We really want to learn firsthand from people who have lived highs and lows on projects. A few minutes ago, you just explained how we see successes of the projects and failures of the projects, right? So before we dig into one of your projects, it would be great if you can talk about the differences between what we may call owners designers and design build designers.
Oh, that's a big question, I think, but a good question. I think engineers, first of all, the engineers that I've come to know and consulting and especially contracting, by and large, we're all the same. We're all engineers and we all want to do the right thing. I've met very few engineers that didn't want to do the right thing. In fact, I don't know if I've met even one that didn't want to do the right thing somewhere. But I would say that the environments are different. And when I was in consulting, and I was in consulting for about 8 years before doing the Geopier thing. The environment is one in which you give away your value on every project. So in every project you retain to provide expert opinion, and then you provide that expert opinion in the form of a report or engineering drawings, and you transfer your value. And as such, it's hard to retain that creative value that you might create. You might create for one project, but you've given it away as part of the universe now, and everybody knows it. And as such, there is little motivation to give away too much value. You have a certain fee that's associated with this project. As you start putting yourself out there, then the risk threshold that's associated with this recommendation becomes larger because there's more unknown. And that brings risk to your company and to your professional stature. And so because of the way the industry is set up, there's a propensity not to provide, not to be too risky, and therefore to limit the value that you might be able to provide. But in the specialty contracting, because you retain the value from project to project to project, you're incentivized to go ahead and accept some of that risk. And so you accept some of that risk, you understand it is, you quantify the risk, you find ways to make sure you evaluate the risk before the building goes up, and you do those kinds of things, you have more control. But it's really the environment that changes the risk threshold, in my view, between a consulting engineer and a specialty contracting engineer. Did I answer your question?
Yes, very much. I think it's a fine line between the two. And then if you don't understand the fine line, and if you don't understand the risks each parties can bring into the project, then it will be a disaster.
Oh, yeah.
Cord, I think if you ask owners designers if they can eliminate risk, they would more often say yes. And I say that because many cases where I see it's an owner's design, they have very, very strict specifications, and they have very prescriptive information, and also they have a sculptory language that basically tries to put everything else on the owner, put everything else on the contractor. I think if you ask design build designers, they would say, no, they can't eliminate risk, or more often they would say that. Would you agree with such a distinction?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you, Tim. I'd agree, but I would also say that real risk is never eliminated, right? There is risk involved with the geo profession. There's risk involved with living in the world, and there's risk involved with our geo profession. So for those who think that by writing a set of specifications or transferring responsibilities from one party to another, that by doing so you eliminate risk, I think the risk is still there, but you transfer risk. And you transfer risk from yourself as much as possible to somebody else. And part of that's because there's no reward in that environment to accept any risk for yourself. And then getting to the second part, the geotechnical engineer that works for a specialty contractor, you're forced to accept that risk. If you want to bid that project, the risk of that project comes with it. And you have to find a way to identify that risk, minimize that risk, maybe do some testing up front to make sure that if you are going beyond what you would normally go beyond in trying to win the project, that you fully identify what you're doing. Maybe it goes back, Tim, to your story about the load test. You know, you had a story about the 3/4 of an inch load test.
He got it right on the dot.
Yeah, and
he didn't say 5/8 of an inch.
Yeah, and
but no, I mean, I think that's an important lesson that maybe our younger listeners could grasp, and that is whether you're on the owner's side or you're on the contractor's side, there is risk, and who is really well built to deal with risk are contractors. They know it's there. And there's really no way on the owner's side that they can just write like a foolproof specification or a foolproof set of notes that where the contractor, you're kind of trying to shoehorn them into a position where there's no compensation for them to cover their risk in certain cases. That those contractors that would fall into that shoehorn aren't in business anymore, and the ones that are in business are shrewd enough to know when the people are trying to shoehorn them into it, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we see plenty of projects where somebody's really trying to transfer that risk over to us, and you know, like I said earlier, if you want to go ahead and have that opportunity to work on that project, you have to find a way to deal with it. You're exactly right.
We are coming up on our sponsor break, but before we do that, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about your project. I assume that you and Geopier were the design build contractor for ground improvement. It's a design build highway project where contractor, designer, geotechnical specialist, everyone were involved, and a 35 feet high MSCE wall over improved ground. More litigious with design build compared to design bid build. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, this was a fun exercise when you invited me to come talk on this podcast to embrace a project that didn't do so well. And I think it's never comfortable for folks to do that. But this project, you had right. It was an MSC wall that was somewhere in the Midwest, and about 35 feet tall. And it was a pretty standard kind of thing, kind of a standard wall, standard Geopier kind of construction, standard profile, standard a lot of things. But what was not standard was about 400 feet section of that MSC wall slid. And it didn't slide just a little bit lucky. it slid a lot. It slid 8 feet sideways. So it really kind of moved a little bit. And you couldn't really look left to right and say, no, not much of an issue. There was an issue, right away. If you didn't call that a failure, I'm not sure what you'd call a failure. That was the project.
Thanks, Cord. Okay, so it's time for us to take a brief break and recognize the sponsor for this episode. Geostructures is a company of design builders that love using innovative ground improvement and earth retention solutions to solve foundation support, slope stability, and grade separation problems for their clients. They believe that anyone can bid a set of plans, but real value occurs by improving that plan, by providing an efficient design that is easy to build. It lowers overall project costs and improves the schedule. Geostructures President and CEO Mike Cowell joins us. Welcome, Mike.
Hello, Tim. Glad to be here, and great to see Cord and everybody. So appreciate the opportunity to ask Cord some questions, and they will not be royalty related. But anyway, over the past 20 years, we've worked together on a lot of projects, and from baseball stadiums and hockey arenas, 14-story office buildings. And over those 20 years, every once in a while, doesn't happen very often, thank God, we get the call from the owner, and the owner says, hey, listen, I'm having a problem with my building. I think it's settling. You need to be here for a meeting right away. Tomorrow morning, get here. And now, considering our Geo-Professional Business Association background, what we've learned from being a member there and just the school of hard knocks, how would you advise, say, some of our listeners on how to handle a situation like that?
Well, that's a tough question, Mike, but I think a real good one. It seems to me, I look back at the first time I got such a call at Geopier, and at first, your first reaction, my first reaction was denial. You get the call, I don't think so, couldn't have happened, and then there's a little bit of fear, and the fear kind of sets in, and because it's fear of the unknown and fear of being accused of things, and then you go to the meeting, and your question was, how do you handle yourself at that meeting, and knowing, at least I remember going into that meeting with the fear and a little bit of denial, and not wondering what was going to happen to me. It happened to us, and one thing I would say, and I learned a lot of this right from you, Mike, is the first thing to do when you have one of those meetings. It sounds crazy, but say hello to everybody. Because everybody in that room is in the room for a reason. They have skin in that game. They have a need, a need that needs to be met. And saying hello, as engineers, we tend not to want to say hello to people. We tend to be introverts. And learning to say hello. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to stay calm and to realize that, there's something, and then focus on the data. What happened and when did it happen and how did it happen? And I remember you, Mike, you taught me a few years ago, maybe when I first started working with you, you used to tell me, Cord, let's just do the dragnet approach, right? Just the facts, ma'am, and you used to use that phrase. I've used that many times myself since. And so you get the facts and you line them up, and to realize everybody in that room has a need. The need needs to be met and satisfied, including the owner who paid some money to get this thing right. If you focus on those things, you can quickly focus on getting to a practical solution to the problem. Not defensive solution, not one where you're hiding things. You're just speaking to the facts and solving things practically. And I've found that by doing so, treating people well, they'll treat you well, and you get to a good solution almost all the time.
had two more questions. Next question is, you've been at Geopier quite a long time, and over the last, say, 15 years, we've developed dozens of ways to install aggregate piers and rigid inclusions. And I was just wondering, which one of the inventions do you believe had the biggest impact on the geotechnical industry, and which one are you the most proud of?
Yeah, well, I'd have to go back to good old Nat Fox's first Geopier, right? That classic GP system, which is still being used today worldwide, really changed the world. And it was so simple. Maybe that's why it changed the world so much. It was so simple and so effective. Tim talked earlier about the load test that went exactly to 3/4 of an inch, and you could really dial it in. And I always say that was the most fundamental. All the other things we've done have been wonderful, but not as transformative, in my view. The one that I guess there's two that I really like that are maybe one's a little quirky. One's a Densipact thing, which was a compaction tool. It's not being used very much, but it was creative. But the one that I think I'm most proud of is the impact chain head, and it's used in the impact and a rampack system. I know all these X1. These are all things that we do, and it's a way of using a skirt of chains to act as a valve below grade, and it's the only valve that I know that can withstand that kind of harsh environment, and it works really amazingly well. So I thought that was a creative one.
Yeah, better than the plates, I'll tell you that. Last question. Over the last 20 years, you've seen a lot of different projects, and which project were you most amazed at in terms of its performance when you use ground improvement elements?
Think about that a little bit. I go back to our early years together, Mike, and some of those early projects, it was amazing how simple a tool like this Geopier could do so well. But the one that sticks in my mind the most is this highway embankment in Ecuador. And it was this embankment over this marshy ground on the surface, and it was liquefiable sand. And they had a magnet, and we put in impact piers, about 9 feet on center. And it was in silty, liquefiable soils. They had the big one about 3 or 4 years after we built these things. And the big one was magnitude 8 and a PGA on the order of 0.4 G. And it shook the whole country of Ecuador. There was an embankment that was not stabilized and not improved in any way, but a similar embankment that catastrophically failed, not too far from the embankment that we had worked on. And the one we worked on, there was a hairline crack down the center line of the roadway. And to see the dramatic difference of those performance in real earthquakes, that was stunning. Yep.
Well, thanks, Cord, and good luck bearing your soul on the rest of this.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Hey, Mike,
Thank you so much.
thank you for joining us, and thanks to Geostructures for your support.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thanks very much to Mike and Geostructures. And now for the conclusion of our episode.
Before our sponsor break, Cord, you were telling us about a 400-foot-long section of MSE wall that failed. This wall was supported by improved ground that was designed by Geopier. Take us back. How did the news reach you? And what were your next steps in this situation?
Oh, wow. It was in the springtime. And I think anybody who, this was a stability issue. And most folks who's dealt with stability issues, most of us, Tim, I'm sure you're in this group as well. Lucky you too. The stability issues often occur in the springtime after a big rain. And sure enough, it rained at that job site tremendously before this problem occurred. But you get the call, and in my case, I think the call came from a region engineer who had worked on this project. Called the headquarters office and said, Houston, we got a problem, and then the next thing you see is a picture that comes across the email wire, and it's like, yeah, no doubt, we do have a problem. So that was first. Your heart kind of stops, and you look at that and you say, oh goodness, what happened?
Cord, I understand that two aspects were identified as relevant to the failure. One was a difference between the design, which was based on 30% drawings, and the as-built condition. The second one was the unanticipated soil behavior. Mm-hmm. So let's start with the first one. Isn't it normal that there are changes to the 30% design? That's why it is called as 30% design. Isn't it vital that those changes are usually communicated to you as the designer? So what went wrong?
Well, that's a good question, Lucky. And I would say that, when things go wrong on projects, it's almost always about communication. There's always communication somewhere in a root cause somewhere. On this particular project, it was a design build job as opposed to a design bid build job. And so in a design bid build job, there's more time for the owner's engineer to develop the scope and do the investigation, do the analyses, write the specifications, put the project out for bid, all of those things. And design build, for those of us who have done these, and I know Tim's done a lot of them, the schedule goes fast. And you have arguably complete information or not. The bidding occurs as a subcontractor as the project is still being designed. So in this particular case, there was a grade change. There was a low area at the toe of the wall that wasn't identified by in the project documents, but with sufficient time and investigation would have been discerned, but it wasn't identified as a critical section. So it was one of these things where in the communication speed and the speed of the development of the project, as the project went through the owner's engineer and then through us, this low spot wasn't identified in the proper way, and it was significant. And then the second part was the soil behavior, and the soil behavior was characterized based on pretty normal geotechnical approaches, normal in situ tests and those kinds of things. And it just happened to be that the correlations that were drawn using those tests, shear strength correlations, they happened to be incorrect for this particular wall. And so those were the two changes.
Well, Cord, and you had mentioned to us earlier when we were discussing the project that in this case, the geotechnical specialist, they provided explicitly the soil parameters to be used in the design. And you use them. But in this particular case, you mentioned that you probably would not have used different ones yourself, but just in general, in the design build environment, let's just say in a project, you look at it, the soil parameters were provided explicitly by the geotechnical specialist, and you don't agree with them. Could bidding it put you at a disadvantage if you change the soil parameters, the design parameters, and it leads to a more expensive design? Aren't you penalizing yourself for having too much knowledge?
That's a really good question, Tim. Let's see, if you bid it with more conservative parameter values,
Because you know something.
yeah, because you know something, then the chances are that you would not be awarded the project, because
That's
you're
right.
probably going to have a solution that you develop, not necessarily, but you probably have a solution that's going to be more conservative than those you're bidding against.
It depends on the degree, right? But don't you kind of see this issue that if it's a competitive environment and someone explicitly puts the parameters together, if you think they're too aggressive, or let's say a design builder thinks they're too aggressive, they can be penalized for not having too much information or too much knowledge,
You can be penalized or not.
or
What
walk
you
away.
look at it
I
is,
guess.
you can also, like in this particular case, you could win the project with the parameter values and then pay on the backside. So I'm not sure that, being penalized for not winning the project is a penalty in this.
It's a strange conundrum, isn't it?
It is. It is. In a legal environment, you have the right to rely on the engineering that was provided by another professional engineer who's skilled in the craft. And so, from a legal perspective, that's fully allowed. And the example there would be a structural engineer has the right to rely on earth pressures provided by a geotechnical engineer who is skilled in the craft of geotechnical engineering. And in that way, we have the right to rely on the parameter values provided by others. Now, that said, the project documents also said, but you have to perform your own geotechnical analyses and select your own parameter values. But here's what we used. So it was a bit of a conundrum. Yeah.
Cord, I know you're the kind of person that takes any experience, good or bad, and use it to improve. I know that because you're a leader in the industry, and that's what leaders do. And it also kind of goes back to your quote by Harry Seed. As I was kind of preparing for this session, I did a little bit of checking around, and I found a quote by philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And he said, "There will always be rocks in the road ahead of us. They will either be stumbling blocks or stepping stones. It all depends on how you use them." Now, I did not intend to have it a pun, but given the fact that we deal with rocks, this quote makes sense. So for a minute, I want you to just think, if you think of this project as a rock in your road, were you able to make it into a stepping stone? And if so, how?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think that, thinking about Harry Seed's quote from before and Nietzsche's quote now, it seems to me that when life is going just grandly and swimmingly, most of us don't learn too much from life during that time. When life gives us difficulties and troubles and heartache and other things like that, that's when we're being tested, and that's when we have an opportunity to learn. And the question is, are we as individuals and human beings open to those opportunities? I'm speaking broadly, not just for geotechnical engineering or problem projects, but just in life. And so, these difficulties each time are opportunities to learn and to get better. You might even have a philosophy that these opportunities are afforded you in your life and until you learn how to handle them gracefully, and then maybe you get other kinds of opportunities to go from. So in this particular case, I would say it's about people. It always comes down to people, in my view, and it's about figuring out how to do the right thing for the owner, who deserves to have in this case, a wall that's standing up and built properly, and contribute to the extent of not just our liability, but the right thing. And yet how to also perhaps allow other people to understand that they also had some responsibility here, and to do that in a way that that worked, and that can be challenging and difficult, but we got there.
Excellent. Well, Cord, just we want to thank you for coming on and being so transparent and so honest and talking about a difficult subject when you're an engineer, and that is a project that we use the term failure, but was a challenge, was a big headache. And thank you for sharing that with us.
This will cost a lot of money too. But what I'd say about that though is, not to be flippant, but nobody died. Nobody was injured. No car went off the highway. Thank goodness. It really came down to about money, and if it comes money, it's okay, right? And I'm not trying to belittle things, and I'm not trying to make things seem rosier than they are. But in the grand scheme of things, worked out okay.
Thank you so much, Cord. Thank you. This was amazing.
On behalf of DFI, we hope you enjoyed this episode. The views, information, and opinions expressed during Deep Foundation Institute's podcasts are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of DFI. DFI does not verify or take responsibility for the accuracy of the information contained, nor does it warrant that the information contained herein is suitable for any general or specific use. The podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. Editing, modification, or redistribution of this podcast is prohibited. Proudly brought to you by our series sponsor, Peer Research, and today's episode sponsor, Geostructures. Thanks for your time. Keep on surviving.